Chapter 14. A Piano Serenade. I was anxious. The day had been exhausting. The flight, an interview at one of the big Paris studios before I could finally set my bags down at home. I'd sent Julien a message the moment the doors were closed, and since then I'd managed to unwind under a long shower. I'd gotten into the habit of not keeping my phone on me at all times. Officially, so it wouldn't become an obsession. In truth, I'd adopted the habit to resist the sometimes stubborn urge to check whether Julien had answered or called. In a year, he never had, and my phone had drifted further and further away. Some days, like today, I thought myself an idiot for waiting around for a man to give me a sign. It had never happened to me before, not once. Chloe, ever the teasing sister, had reminded me that even when we were young, I'd only ever had admirers. Never real heartbreak. I'd told her I hadn't been in love back then, and yet I felt I'd had two fairly serious disappointments as an adult. Though I'd gotten over both quickly enough, taking refuge in music. But now, as Chloe put it, I was running on empty. Unable to take a single step away from him, even though there had always been at least an ocean between us all this time. Julien had no social media accounts. Leo had one, which I followed discreetly, but he seldom posted photos of his father. It had happened once in a year, and I'd taken a screenshot I sometimes stared at for long stretches. It was truly hopeless. This was usually the point where I'd feel the need to think about something else. Or better, to stop thinking altogether. My feet carried me to the studio. Music had become my refuge again, and I gave myself over to it without restraint. I lit candles. I wanted the room to stay dim. I began with simple pieces, loosening my fingers, working my wrists. Then I replayed a few tracks from my latest album, but I'd perhaps practiced them too much lately, and the rhythm brought no relief. I let myself be swept away by a classical opera I'd always loved, an ode to timeless love. As in life, the opening bars were light, almost a whisper. Then the theme settled in, bright, swelling, filling the room with joyful flights. Then the sky darkened. The chords grew heavier, deeper. The melody lost itself in a frenzy of feelings impossible to name, let alone control. Then came the explosion. Unrestrained. Betrayal. Or love, shattering into 1,000 pieces against the wall of cowardice. And the breath falls. Yesterday's proud lovers, invincible in their panache, become tomorrow's defeated, bitter and cynical. Or else, and this was always the surprise, they became the penitent, begging, crawling, crying out beyond all reason, to love that always rises from its ashes, for those who believe, serene now, eternal. I had forgotten everything for the span of an ode to love. I was no longer myself. I was my fingers on my piano. With the last notes, my shoulders dropped. I could feel the smile on my lips. I opened my eyes. When had I closed them? I felt his presence before I saw him. He stood in the doorway, motionless, eyes wide open, seized. Perhaps he had seen a ghost. To me, it felt as though I was seeing one. Julien. What if I stood up and then realized it was an apparition, risen straight from my sheet music, come to taunt me? I decided not to move, so as not to break the spell. My eyes, poor things, were trapped. After so long without resting on him, they took him in without the slightest shame. His blue-green eyes, his broad, square shoulders. He hadn't changed. He spoke first.
Bonsoir, Elena. Sorry to disturb you. Marguerite let me up. I could hear the music from downstairs, but I didn't dare interrupt.
Disturb me? After a year? I said nothing. This time I was the one without words. I kept staring at him. After all, after 12 months of talking to a wall, I could afford to hold my silence for a few moments. I'd missed the sound of his voice, deep, steady. It was exactly like the voice notes I'd listened to dozens of times, alone, when the longing became physical. I stood up. I don't know why.
You asked me to come.
I walked toward him. I saw him flinch, almost a half step back that he caught before it landed. Was he afraid? Of me? I stopped when there was only one step left between us. I've asked you so many things these past months. To forgive me, to talk to me, whether you still thought about me. His gaze held mine.
Elena, have mercy on me. I don't know how to play games, not when it comes to love.
So, it is love between us? He didn't answer. I took his hand in both of mine. He didn't pull away. Julien, tell me, is it love?
You don't know, Elena.
How would I know? You've been silent for so long. I caught my breath. I had to tell him everything. His hand in mine gave me courage. I love you, Julien, but I think you know that. And my heart bled for that little girl who was your daughter, for your pain, and even for her mother's. My throat closed. I shut my eyes for a moment, holding back the flood that threatened to spill over. Not now. He hadn't answered either, and the thought hurt. What if I was wrong? I let my hand fall slowly, but he didn't let go. I lifted my eyes to his. I know I hurt you, but does that mean you give up? That you give up on me? He closed the last step between us, and then I was in his arms.
Elena, of course I love you. You're my heart. If you'd been here, close to me, I wouldn't have lasted a day. But the distance made it easier. Now I know you've made your choice.
I don't know how long we stayed like that, holding each other in that silent reunion. Then gently, he asked for a kiss, and I gave it back. My heart surrendered without a last cry. More than the touch of his mouth on mine, the strength that he irradiated carried me to a place I'd never known. An infinite tenderness rose inside of me, and a longing to stay like this, in his arms, beyond time. The tears fell on my cheeks before I knew I was crying. He drew back gently and looked at me, uncertain.
Elena,
He said after a moment.
I didn't keep silent to hurt you or to teach you a lesson. I was giving you space to change your mind. You weren't ready for us when all of that happened. And I nearly lost my mind when you left.
I let him speak. He was right.
You had to follow your heart. And I'm glad it brought you back here.
You're right. I had to come back on my own. I took a breath and said softly what was still weighing on me. But the silence, Julien. I can't go through that again. He smiled.
I wouldn't be able to. Not a second time.
He went on, more serious now.
But you can't run away a second time either. You know my life is here, and I know yours is 10,000 miles from here. So how will we do this?
His hand around my waist trembled slightly as he finished. I was beginning to know him. He was nervous. My mother has grown very fond of this house. She's come back often, you know that. She's going to move in full time. As for me, Monsieur Moreau, all I need is a studio. Why not a room upstairs at the domain with a view over the orchards? It would be a beautiful place to compose. He rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. He exhaled so deeply that I felt it in the deepest part of me. This was a moment of magic, one I would carry with me always. Some moments last a lifetime.